Hey everyone, in this video, I'm going to take on the best trans arguments I've come across for why trans athletes should compete against women in women's sports. I would say about 90% of all the trans arguments fit into one of these four categories, which are perpetually being used. And I want to give my response as a woman athlete. I think it's important to note that it's actually a very small but loud minority of trans people who do compete and believe they should have the right to compete against women in women's sports. The overwhelming majority of people supporting this are not trans, have no athletic background, and are not involved in sports in any capacity. I've decided to order these four arguments from the least valid to the most valid, in my opinion. So, let's get into it. The first argument that it's only a few trans athletes, so what's the big deal? Well, it's a big deal to the women and girls that these trans athletes are displacing. Off the podium, out of the next round of competition, short of receiving prize money, and missing out on athletic scholarships. They are not just displacing one woman or girl off the podium, but everyone behind them. Telling these women and young girls who are directly affected that their feelings, their goals, and their efforts are inconsequential will demotivate and disillusion them from competing. Athletes, parents of athletes, coaches, volunteers, friends and family, and others that are associated with women's sports are the ones most impacted by this. And I can understand. It can be challenging for non-participants to connect to the problems the rapid influx of trans athletes are creating for women's sports. So here's an analogy that might make it feel more relatable. Imagine tomorrow morning, your boss calls a meeting with everyone in your company and announces, we're going to start introducing robots into our workforce.
This is a humanoid robot, which means it looks, it talks, and it even acts, well, like a human. So does that mean it could take a human's job like mine?
You better believe it. No, I'm only joking, not really.
Naturally, this provokes a fear reaction amongst employees because robots have a performance advantage. In response, the boss says, calm down, we're just replacing one employee, it's not the end of the world. And suppose the company has 1,000 employees. You might think to yourself, well, it's no big deal, it's just one robot. What's the chances that it's me? But what if that person being replaced is you? Is it still no big deal? At your exit interview, your manager might say, it's nothing personal, it's just business, thinking that might soften the impact. However, it is personal to you because it affects your livelihood, security, family, and future. Like the robot example, displacing employees from the company, and in sports, displacing girls and women from teams and competition. It starts off as small, maybe one trans athlete causing a displacement. But then, as this is accepted and more trans athletes start to participate, the gap between trans athletes and women becomes greater. For each girl and woman displaced, it is a big deal. One woman or girl displaced is one too many. It's not a numbers problem, it's a category problem. Men don't belong in women's sports. Period. When a trans athlete breaks a women's world record, it sends a message to all the previous record holders, all the current competitors, and thousands of women who came before and competed, that their efforts were for nothing. If allowed to continue, it will not take long for trans athletes to own all the world records and all the podium places, essentially erasing women from the history of sports. Males going through gender dysphoria or an identity crisis are rarely hypermasculine alpha types. Some exceptions include people like Bruce Jenner and Chris Beck, but predominantly they're coming from places of being less successful against men. For example, there's a shared history amongst some trans athletes where they're mediocre at best competing in the men's category, transitioned, and then started winning in the women's category. Another storyline is where they didn't even compete before transitioning, then started a sport for fun, and 2 years later started winning women's competitions. Is it possible for trans athletes to win Olympic medals? Yes. Some have already broken women's world records, but competing at the Olympics is much more restrictive and selective than competing at your weekend bike race, which reduces the number of trans athletes at the games. First, each Olympic sport is represented only every 4 years. And each nation only gets a select few athletes, who typically undergo an extensive selection process, like world rankings, time trials, and points that are acquired over time. Second, not all competing countries recognize biological males as women, and therefore they wouldn't be considered in the selection process. And third, in the past, the IOC required trans athletes to reduce their testosterone levels to 10 nanomoles per liter for 12 months. Given these restrictions, yes, it is still possible. However, even with their biological advantage, at the Olympic level, a trans athlete must still develop the skills, years of practice, and muscle memory to outperform an elite women athlete. But if the trend of acceptance continues, then in a few years, I wouldn't be surprised to see more trans athletes at the Olympics, winning gold medals. Where trans athletes currently excel is by relying on their strength, larger frame, power, and aerobic advantage. But this is not always the predominant advantage in high-skill sports. I started skiing at the age of 2, and no matter how strong or athletically capable, a man at 30 learning how to ski for the first time will never beat me in a ski race, because skiing is a highly technical sport. But could a man ski for a few years and beat most women in a master's race? Most certainly. This is where most trans athletes win. In local competitions, high school, and university level events. Most of these competitions don't have the same level of restrictions as the Olympics. For example, they don't require any hormone suppressants or any time on hormone suppressants. You basically just show up, tick the box for which category you want to participate in, no questions asked. This argument really frustrates me because it suggests that a trans athlete winning at the local level against a young girl or a master's woman is not as significant or consequential as an Olympic gold medal. Sure, the Olympics is a world stage and the pinnacle of athletic performance, but to every woman and girl athlete, their race, whatever level that might be, means the world to them. It's their version of the Olympics, and being displaced is very hurtful. Obviously, this topic is really sentimental to me because I am an athlete. I've been competing since the age of 6 in alpine skiing competitions, and I've done many other sports competitively throughout my life, like soccer, baseball, football, and hockey. And to hear arguments like, oh, it's just a few trans athletes, what's the big deal? And oh, they're not winning Olympic gold medals, so what's the big deal? It's really frustrating to me because it feels like the people who make these arguments have no sympathy or empathy or recognize the hundreds and thousands of girls and women who want a safe and supportive environment to play and compete without any male advantage and without politics or a social agenda, just to be with other women and girls, to have fun. Every single girl and woman whom a trans athlete displaces matters. Not just the woman that comes in second to a trans athlete at the Olympics. This third argument that is often mentioned, they will say, preventing trans athletes from competing is discrimination on the basis of gender. But like most of these arguments, they don't consider the woman's position. Because women would say, well, a biological man competing against us in the women's division would be discrimination on the basis of sex. The problem is, you can't have it both ways. You need to pick which one you will defend. Are we saying gender is more important than sex? Or is sex more important than gender? My position is obvious. I think sex is the most logical and proven method of dividing humans into competitive categories. The reason I say this is because sex is science, versus gender is constructed. Sex is for life. Whatever chromosomes you are born with are the chromosomes you will die with. These chromosomes will have a huge impact on your athletic performance, especially if you're XX or XY. And that's why we've created categories based on these two sexes. Now, with regards to gender, it's a social construct that humans have created. And as a society, we've decided that people can choose their gender identity and change it anytime they like and as many times as they would like. This argument is not whether it's right or wrong. It's just not science or permanent. As a thought experiment with regard to sport, if I had the ability to self-identify, I would choose the side that favors my ability to win. It's just human nature. And although the overwhelming majority of people are good, as always, there is a small minority of people who will take advantage of the system, including selecting their gender for their own personal gains. If we want sporting competitions to be fair, we need to trust, but also be able to verify. If you fill out a form saying you're a woman, compete, win, and take a urine test, and it turns out you're a man, that disqualifies you from a sex-based competition. Same thing for age. If a 30-year-old man wanted to compete in an under 10 boys category, you would verify by asking for some ID or their birth certificate. If gender is a social construct and there is no way to verify a person's gender, then I think it's impossible to have fair competition. Another important consideration that is less discussed and often taken for granted is the social aspect of sports. Introducing a man into a woman's locker room changes people's behavior and mannerisms from relaxed and safe to a heightened sense of attention. It changes the dynamic of training sessions from supportive to disillusioned, and competitions from being focused on your performance to the advantages of the trans athlete competitor. And in a contact sport, the increased fear of danger they impose on you. The point here is that women's sports teams, like men's sports teams, have a unique culture that is developed around the preferences of their biological sex, which makes team members feel included, supported, and respected. Introducing biological men into a women's culture creates discomfort, vulnerability, and potential anxiety that could affect their well-being, leading some team members to quit and potentially forever be impacted by the situation. Coming back full circle, discrimination is only valid if it's verifiable. You can discriminate against someone's skin color, ethnicity, age, disability, and sex because those things a person has no control over, are permanent and measurable. But if you make a choice to identify differently, you have the freedom to do that. But you can't force the people around you to accept and accommodate that decision. For example, if I identify as disabled and the Canadian Paralympic ski team refuse to accept me on their team, they are not discriminating against me. They can scientifically and medically run tests to determine I am not disabled and therefore do not qualify. Personally, I think it should be the same for trans athletes. This is women's sports, XX chromosomes. If you do not have XX chromosomes, it's not discrimination, it's just science. You either compete against men or create an open category that is inclusive to all genders, period. This argument states that being inclusive is more important than being fair. Personally, I think it's their strongest argument so far on the face of it. But inclusivity is not the purpose of sports and competition. Yes, in a fun, non-competitive environment, inclusivity is common. But when stakes are on the table, fairness is the most important factor. Because if instituted, it would fundamentally change the inherent values of sports we have come to love and cherish. We believe sports should be fair, which is why we have strict anti-doping policies, different age categories, and different sex categories. As humans, we created sports. If we want something different, like prioritize inclusivity over fairness, then that's possible. But we also lose the current meaning of sports in the process. So as a society, we need to ask ourselves, what do we want sports to represent? If all we care about is inclusivity, then it would make sense to have just one big open category that is inclusive to all ages and all sexes, and all pharmaceuticals and all types of medical procedures to enhance athletic performance. Basically, a human free-for-all. That is the extreme version of inclusivity. Now the other side would be extreme fairness, where we're gonna have dozens, if not hundreds, of competitive categories based on height, weight, income bracket, genetic factors, bone density, menstrual cycle, race, ethnicity, hormone levels, red blood cell count, and lung capacity, etc. Now, obviously both of those scenarios are undesired, but we have to find a happy medium that we think is both inclusive and fair. To date, that has been to categorize based on sex at birth, men and women. We've also created age categories to allow younger kids and teenagers to participate, as well as older adults, and categories based on physical and mental disabilities. And in some sports, we've created weight categories, where weight is a significant impact on performance outcomes. This has worked, and it continues to work. Everyone can play sports. And even if you're not genetically gifted, if you work hard enough, you can still make it to the top. There are plenty of examples of that. At the heart of the inclusivity argument is that some women have an advantage like height over others, which is true. So sports in its current form is inherently unfair. Yes, we're not all genetic twins and have grown up in the same environment. But then they follow that with, well, including biological men in women's sports can't be considered unfair because it's already unfair to begin with. But that's where they're wrong, because the gap in variability between female elite athletes is much smaller than the gap between an elite female athlete and an elite male athlete. So sure, a female athlete that is 6 foot will have a height advantage over another female that is 5'6". But only around 1% of US women are 6 feet or taller versus over 15% of men. So the variability is much greater. Furthermore, height might be the only variability between those two female athletes. But between a female and a male athlete, there is significant variability purely on the basis of sex, which gives males an athletic advantage across multiple different biological factors, like height, lung capacity, red blood cells, fast twitch muscle fibers, power, strength, and speed. Furthermore, the inherent differences between women is what give us the breadth and depth of our sport, that different sports tend to favor different types of athletes. For example, gymnasts tend to be smaller, flexible, and powerful compared to cross-country skiers, who tend to be taller, with larger lung capacities and muscular endurance. These sports favor different types of women athletes. And I would argue there's a sport for every type of woman, from MMA to rowing, rock climbing, volleyball, powerlifting, golf, cricket, skeleton, etc. A final point, sports at the professional level operate as a business. It's entertainment dictated by the consumer. If each NBA team had to have 5 different categories of athletes, it would significantly dilute the value of their product because they have 5 times more athletes to pay and 5 times more product to sell. It just doesn't work. And ultimately, that is the problem with every single one of these arguments, is that they're asking for special exceptions to the rules for a few trans athletes at the significant expense of all women athletes. And that doesn't work because eventually the exception becomes the norm and it flips. Women athletes become the exception, the minority, the few women in women's sports. And I don't think that's what we want as a society. The main arguments outlined in this video, often voiced by trans athletes and their supporters, for why they believe their participation in women's sports is harmless, does not hold up for the reasons I outlined. Everybody should have access to sports, but we can't progress the conversation with trans athletes until they acknowledge the unfair nature of their participation in women's sports. But once acknowledged, we can progress a conversation about how trans athletes can be included in an open category. So we are left with 3 options when it comes to trans athletes. 1, they continue to participate. 2, they get banned. Or 3, we create a solution that is fair for everyone. I have new videos every week. Please like and subscribe. It really helps the algorithm get it out to more people. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.